Well, welcome to the Complete Guide to Evictions. This is a webinar from us here at TurboTenant, and we have a very special guest with us who will be introduced at the end. So to start things off, my name is Krista Ruther. I am the Senior Content Marketing Writer here at TurboTenant. It's a very lovely job full of lovely people like my boss, Jonathan. Jonathan?
Wow, what a good segue. I'm Jonathan. I am the Director of Education and Community here at TurboTenant. And if you're not already familiar with us, TurboTenant is an all-in-one platform for landlord software. So if you are trying to market your property, trying to find tenants, screen them, create lease agreements, e-signatures, you can do all of that with us. So, but we are here to talk about evictions. So let's dive in. All right, so we will go over the basics, the costs, alternatives to eviction, and then our case study at the very end. We have Brendan, who was kind enough to join us. We will introduce him once we get to that point. And once again, if you guys have questions as we go through, I encourage you to use the chat or the Q&A. We'll be looking at both. And the basics, let's jump in. So an eviction is basically what happens when you have to get a renter out of your rental property. Not super pleasant, but it does happen. We should also say it doesn't happen super often. This is not a thing that landlords should anticipate happening every year. Hopefully it's very, very rare, but we'll go through all of that process. Something else we want to make sure everyone understands is that the eviction process can vary a lot by state, by city, by county, even depending on where you are. So we are going to be covering sort of broad strokes of the eviction process and what that looks like. It may be a little different in your area. So we encourage you to check out your local laws. We actually have a section on our site that shows you landlord tenant laws in your state, and we'll drop that in the chat. But without further ado, eviction notice. So this is basically how you start the eviction process. If you have if you have a problem tenant, or if something is a recurring issue, you would issue an eviction notice. So this is a document filled out by the landlord that provides reasons for an eviction. And there are 3 types for this. So we'll go each type, but first of all, I want to direct you to this pro tip in the corner. A self-help eviction is an action that a landlord takes to evict a tenant outside of the legal means. So this would be like making it really unpleasant for them to remain in the rental property. Maybe you're blasting music at 3 a.m. or something until they leave. This is not something you should do. If it comes to an eviction, if there is that big of an issue between you and your tenant, then you should pursue an eviction process, or we do have some alternatives we'll talk about later, but a self-help eviction should not be one of those.
True, okay, it is not the way to go.
So getting into the different types. The first one is a pay or quit notice. So this one requires the tenant to either pay their rent in full or vacate the rental unit within a certain amount of time. Some states require a grace period, after which you can send or deliver the pay or quit notice. Some do not have a grace period. Some of them, the grace period is very, very short. So like we said, it really depends on your local area. Next up is the notice to comply or quit. So this gives the tenant a certain amount of time to fix the issue at hand. And if they don't comply within that time frame, they'll be given an unconditional quit notice. So a good example of this would be excessive noise. Let's say your tenant works on their car at all hours and they're very loud about it. You can issue a notice to comply or quit and say, hey, you really have to stop working on the car in the middle of the night, or else we're going to have to go to an eviction proceeding. And if they do it, great, you just avoided an eviction. That's awesome. If they don't comply, then at that point you would go to an eviction. And a certain note here that we want to add is that keeping good documentation of all of this stuff is very, very important. If it does go to an eviction proceeding and you actually have to go to court, you're going to want to have all of the proof you possibly could. All right, and then our third type, an unconditional quit notice. So this requires the tenant to vacate within a certain period of time without any opportunity for discussion. And you will see us quote the website NOLO a few times here. They're a very good resource for that we found for really landlord laws. We have a quote from them that all states allow landlords to use unconditional quit notices when a tenant has repeatedly violated a lease clause, has substantially damaged the rental unit, is dealing drugs, or for other specified reasons. There are state rules on when a landlord can use an unconditional quit termination notice and how much time the landlord must give the tenant to vacate. So just driving that point home, please do check on your individual state.
Yeah. So with that, we've entered into our first poll of the session. Jonathan, if you wouldn't mind sharing it. Guys, how many evictions do you think landlords across America file in a typical year? Please feel free to select. If you are here for the first session, I might laugh a little if you don't remember the answer to this one. Also, something important while we give you 10 more seconds to click that button. Because eviction proceedings vary so much from state to state, one of the best things you can do is actually go and sit in on your local eviction court and just see how the proceedings go. You know, set some time for yourself in the afternoon, eat whatever you have, go sit down and notice the interactions between the judge and the landlord, see how it all flows, and that will give you the best idea for what to expect in your area. All right. So let's look at this here. Okay, we've got a bit of a spread. So the majority of you are thinking 3.2 million eviction notices are filed across America in a single year, followed by 3.6. Happy to say the 3.6 million have it, or unhappy, I guess, because evictions should be used as a last resort. So quite a few are filed every year. Obviously, this does not take into account any of the COVID years because that skews the data. When you have an eviction moratorium, you can't really file for an eviction, as we saw in March 2020. That has by and large been lifted, although we do have some California-specific information we'll touch on because you guys out west are still under eviction moratoriums in a lot of counties. All right. So to further provide context, I'd like us to take a look at this map from the Eviction Lab. So using their latest stats and figures, you can see here the US eviction filing rate and population in 2018. A little bit of context for the context, right? So the way this map works, the lighter color indicates a lower population, darker color, higher population. And then the size of the red circle is the amount of the eviction filing rate. So a higher rate is going to be a larger circle, like you might see here in Maryland. And then a small circle is going to indicate a low filing rate, like in South Dakota. So might surprise you, but Maryland had the highest eviction filing rate in the US in 2018. And failure to pay rent was the most common type of eviction filed. So it's really interesting to look at Maryland because it doesn't have a very big population, and the rate of eviction filings is really disproportionate to what we would expect of a population that size. In fact, in Baltimore specifically, the eviction rate is 5.3%, which is 2.3 times higher than the national eviction rate of 2.3. You might be asking yourself, well, why? Why is that? Evictions are really nuanced. There are a couple things that we could point to. For example, evictions disproportionately impact people of color, particularly women, and low-income individuals and families, which could help to contextualize Baltimore's high eviction rates. 62.3% of their population indicated they were Black or African American on the latest census. So when you have a high Black population, you could be seeing a disproportionate rate of eviction filings. Additionally, the laws are going to dictate when landlords can file for an eviction and under what circumstances. They're also going to outline when a tenant can withhold rent and under which circumstances. So all of these factors working together with other societal factors, economic factors are causing these eviction rates. But it's hard to pinpoint one exact thing, which is why this kind of complicated process should really be understood before you jump into it. Alrighty, and just before we move on here, I highlighted it, but South Dakota does have the lowest eviction filing rate at just 0.7%, which I found pretty interesting. In our first session, people theorized perhaps that's because it's a lower population and there are not as many rental opportunities. Not sure. Just like it's very difficult to parse through why Maryland's eviction rate is so high, it is equally difficult to parse through why South Dakota's is so low. So with that in mind, let's talk more about the impact of evictions. So from the landlord point of view, you are going to miss out on time with your family to go to court if you pursue an eviction. You're also going to have increased stress levels. Unless you are the Zen master of the West, it's going to be a stressful process when you go to court. Just point of fact. It's a lot of documentation to gather. You have this tenuous relationship with your tenant at that point. You may not be sure what to do day to day or how to communicate. And all of this is just going to cause your blood pressure to rise. And equally importantly, your financials really could take a hit. There are quite a few fees to cover in the eviction process, which we'll detail later at the cost of evictions. But just know it's not as easy as filing a notice and then recouping, let's say, lost rent the next week. That simply doesn't happen. So as a landlord going through this, just consider not only the impacts to you, but also the impacts to your tenant. So from your tenant point of view, they're going to have to find new housing. And you might be saying, well, yeah, Krista, but they did something. They didn't pay rent, or they're working on their car at 3 a.m. And I would say, yes, but it's still such a complicated situation that we really have to explore what those repercussions are in full and then figure out the best solution for everyone moving forward. So they're going to have to find new housing. And in many states, they can actually have legal representation in eviction court, which increases their stress level. In fact, according to civilrightocounsel.org, no jurisdiction in the country provided a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction prior to 2017. As we closed out 2021, there were 3 states and 13 cities with such a right. For greater context, only 3% of tenants nationwide had legal representation during an eviction case in 2021, while 81% of landlord retained legal counsel in that same time frame. So very challenging playing field, we'll call it. The eviction process, well, actually securing a legal eviction is going to hurt the tenant's credit and their ability to find affordable housing in the future, as evictions are one of the most important factors for landlords looking at potential tenants. And last but not least, it is very traumatizing for children. When you evict a family, that becomes a bad core memory for a child, and it's really a nasty situation. So as you can see with the graphic on the right, that is a breakdown of the eviction filing rate by gender from the Eviction Lab, who also made the map a couple slides back. With all this in mind, we really do believe that eviction should only be used as a last resort, which is why we're going to highlight alternatives for evictions later in this presentation.
Yes, we definitely want to drive that home, that evictions are not fun for the landlord or the tenant. In some cases, you will get your lost money back, but not always. In fact, it's probably pretty rare that happens. So yeah, it should be a last resort. Absolutely.
All righty. So returning to our map, there are 5 states that have been highlighted as the worst places to be evicted on the tenant side. So I will pick on my home state here of Colorado. It is the worst place to be evicted because the landlord only has to give the tenant 3 days notice to pay past due rent or correct a lease violation on their first offense. If they have the same problem, the tenant will still get a 3-day notice, but they will have no option to stay in the rental. To really, bring shame to myself here for a second, when I moved into my first apartment, it was a big apartment complex and they were using a property management system, not TurboTenant, that delayed payment for my first month's rent. So I had paid it, but they never charged my bank. And I got a notice stapled to my door. And I was terrified because I had never been in any kind of trouble and I couldn't understand because I had made the payment on my end. And it caused a really bad relationship between me and that property management company until I moved out. So very scary to just all of a sudden have something like that happen. Take that for what it's worth. Additionally, the rest of these states, the reason why they're so tough, they either have very lax or kind of nonsensical timelines for things where, for example, West Virginia, or excuse me, Montana. Montana lets you have 14 days to correct a violation of a lease, but only 3 days to correct an unauthorized pet. Horrifying sounding. You have 24 hours as a tenant to fix changed locks, 3 days to pay past due rent, and 5 days for a second violation of past due rent in 6 months. So it gets very confusing. You don't know what timeline you're being held to or why. It gets murky. So the big thing that I want you to take away from this slide, I don't need to go through every state, especially if no one here is from Montana, does not care about Montana. But the big thing to take away, the reason why it's so bad in these places, there is not facilitated transparency between the landlord and the tenant. It gets murky because they're either obscure timelines or very harsh treatments for a first or second offense. Or alternatively, it just allows the landlord to kind of go off and do whatever they'd like in West Virginia, for example. You don't have to have a set notice time to warn tenants of a pending eviction. You can just choose the time and notify your tenant in writing, in person, or even over the phone. So what can you do if you're in any of these states or any other state? I would say prioritize good communication. That's going to help throughout this tumultuous situation in which you find yourself. Also, be very well versed in your local laws. And actually, I have that link for you here if you have not gotten it yet. Right before we go, I do want to say I promised you some information on California. This is a fine slide to do it because I can point and say, here it is, there's California. So we had a lot of questions in our first session. Because California counties, a fair few of them are still under the eviction moratorium, namely Los Angeles County, which is a pretty sizable county. But on Tuesday of last week, the Board of Supervisors voted 3-2 to move forward with a plan to lift the eviction moratorium by the end of the year, according to the Los Angeles Times. Officials have promised to perform robust outreach to make sure that both tenants and landlords are aware of the shift that's about to take place in the county's 88 cities. And it's important to note that these provisions largely impact non-payment of rent evictions. So if there are other eviction cases, like being a danger to other tenants or neighbors, that should still be able to be pursued at this time, even before the non-payment of rent is lifted, eviction is lifted in the beginning of the year. So in other words, keep your documentation up if there are issues with non-payment of rent, pursue alternatives in the meantime, especially since it sounds like you'll have to wait until December, January to get things moving, and then the courts are likely to be backlogged, and have frank and transparent communications as needed with your tenants.
And one note on that last point of frank and transparent communication, as Krista mentioned, West Virginia, they do allow you to give notice to your tenant that you intend to evict. You can deliver that in writing, in person, or over the phone. We would not recommend to do it over the phone because that is very hard to have any kind of record. That is where we definitely say, do it in writing, have certified mail deliver it. That way you have proof that the tenant received it and it was delivered, and keep a copy for your own records. Because if you do actually go to court, you're definitely going to want as much documentation as you can possibly have.
That's true. Really good note. Okay, so common reasons for eviction. As you can see here, you've got some standard ones, such as non-payment of rent. We've talked about that a little bit. Along with that, property damage. If your tenant takes a baseball bat to your window, that's a good reason to not let them live there anymore. If they are keeping pets when you told them there are no pets, another reason to evict, along with illegal activity. So think dealing drugs. If Walter White was renting, he could be evicted. So anything that is illegal is going to be caused to break the lease via an eviction. Antisocial behavior is an interesting one on this list. Basically, it's not just someone who doesn't talk to you or isn't nice to their neighbors. It's disorderly contact causing a disruption or nuisance in the building or neighborhood, such as fighting or excessive noise. So just keep that in mind. But depending on your state laws, that might not be a good reason for eviction unless other residents are being directly impacted who live in your building. So once again, use that link that I dropped in the chat to get a sense of what your local laws are. And when in doubt, talk to a real estate attorney. They are going to help you figure out what you need to do, the documents you need to keep, and tailor it to your state's laws, which is very important.
Yeah, and this is obviously not an exhaustive list. You can go through with an eviction for any breach of the terms of the lease. And if you find that you're in the middle of lease and something has been a recurring issue, such as your tenants using street parking when you're not supposed to have street parking in that area, you can always add that in a lease addendum. So you could just add that onto the lease, get their signature, make sure they understand, and then you can hold them to it from that point forward.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we've talked a lot about how eviction filing requirements change state to state, but specifically what changes? Well, quite a bit, honestly. We wouldn't have jobs if it was that easy. But eviction qualifications, those change state to state. The type of eviction notice you need to serve, and equally how much time you need to give the tenant to receive that notice changes state to state. So when you inevitably come back to our website to review this deck, you will be able to click on that same link here on this slide that I dropped in the chat. But by and large, just remember that the best landlords stay up to date with their local tenant laws, and that'll go double if you feel there's a violation from your tenant. So use that resource. It is for you. And we want to make sure that if you do have to pursue an eviction, you're doing it by the book. To that end, something that would be great to keep in mind is the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, or URLTA. So this was passed in 1972, and this legislation has been fully adopted by some states. Others have not fully adopted it, but it can still be used to clarify the rights and obligations of both landlords and tenants. So here we see that landlords have to comply with all building codes, repair the building to ensure it's in good condition, provide trash and recycling receptacles, keep the area clean and safe, etc., etc. This is what you are signing on to do as a landlord, by and large, even if your state does not enforce URLTA. And on the flip side, tenants are required to also comply with building codes in regards to safety and security, remove garbage and waste from the rental, keep the rental unit clean, not deliberately break or deface anything on the property, conduct themselves in a safe and peaceful manner, etc. So being well-versed in URLTA at least gives you somewhere to start, where if you you're seeing a behavior or you're hearing reports of a tenant, acting in a way that's impacting their neighbors, you can come back to this list and say, are they upholding this, whether or not it's required by our state, and then decide what to do from there. In fact, what you might want to do is unfortunately start the eviction process. So the first step here, as we've said, is to review URLTA and your local landlord tenant laws. We will never get tired of saying that. We want you to have the best, most actionable information possible. And it simply we cannot sit and go through every single state here on this call in an hour without, running your ears off. We don't want to do that. So make sure that you are as much of an expert on your local landlord tenant laws as you can be, and employ help if you need it. Then, once you've reviewed both of those things, you're going to want to go back to your lease agreement. Is the behavior outlined in the lease agreement with a clear consequence? So non-payment of rent is an easy one for this. Does your lease explain what will happen if they don't pay rent, grace periods, late fees as needed, etc.? If it doesn't, you can either add it in as an addendum or just consider that for your next lease if you're getting to the end of this relationship with your tenant. Also, before we move on here, I would say as a 2.5 step, talk to your tenant. If you have not had issues with them in the past, particularly for non-payment of rent, talk to them first and see how they're doing. It's likely that something has popped up in their life, and maybe you could work something out before you have to pursue the entire eviction process. So always good to remember that there's a human aspect to being a landlord, and checking in with your tenant and just saying, hey, are you doing okay? I noticed that you're late with the rent. Might save you thousands of dollars down the road if you can avoid an eviction. However, if you can't, what you're going to want to make sure you have in tow are these documents as listed in the graphic on the right. So things like a lease agreement, the renter's driver's license, copy of the eviction notice, etc. Everything that you need to pull together to say, this is who my tenant is. Here's the proof that this is who they are. Here's what they agreed to, and this is what's going on in terms of the context of the situation. All right. So next is to actually give the eviction notice to your tenant. So you've already had an informal conversation with them. Things are not resolved. Give them an eviction notice. The type is going to vary depending on your state and the situation that you find yourself in. But by and large, it's going to need to detail the reason that you're evicting them, total damages and rent owed as applicable, a time frame for complying with your demands, and the eviction date if your demands aren't met. Sometimes this is enough to get tenants to act because they do not want to be evicted any more than you want to evict them. So sometimes this is enough and they can get it together, give you what they need, and you're good. If it's not, you're going to begin the eviction process in court. So that is when you'll use all of these documents that we have on the right-hand side, gather them together, bring them to court. And then you start that process, which can take a bit of time, but we'll discuss that later. Once you can successfully evict the tenant, you can then regain property. Regaining property can mean that you can change the locks, you can clean the unit, but bear in mind, if your tenant has abandoned their items there, you're going to have to tend to those. Don't worry though, we have a question and answer for you at the end of the presentation to explain how to approach that situation.
Okay, we do have a few questions that I wanted to make sure we were hitting before we go into the FAQ.
Sure.
Looks like Sheila asked, what is your take for the smoking if it is now legal for that?
Ooh, are they smoking marijuana?
That's
I'm
what
guessing.
I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a clause or an addendum that says no smoking, they are still bound by that, even if smoking marijuana is allowed in your state, because they've agreed to not do that in your property. So you can continue to pursue either some kind of solution, don't smoke in my property, or maybe smoke outside, depends on what you have available. Still absolutely valid reason to have a conversation with them though. Just because it's legal in your state doesn't mean it's legal in your rental unit.
Yeah, that's where it's really useful to clearly outline everything, all of the rules. Smoking is a big one, whether it's tobacco or marijuana. Make sure that's in the lease agreement. And if it's not, at least addendum.
Absolutely.
Okay, getting into FAQs. Okay, so I see a lot of you have asked questions that actually are in the next few slides. So we will get to them right now. First one, how long does it take? This may not be terribly surprising if you've ever had to go to court or do anything through the legal system. It is quite slow, 2 to 3 months on average. So that's on average. That means that there are some that take way longer. This is, once again, dependent on the state and your unique eviction situation. If it's something very cut and dry, like they haven't paid rent in a few months, then that may make it go faster, but it depends on your local courts. A lot of courts are still backlogged as a result of the eviction moratorium. So yes, it could be way longer right now, to be honest. So when we say evictions should be a last resort, this is really what we're talking about, because this is, if you think about it, possibly 3 months that they're going to be in your rental unit, not paying rent. That's rental income not coming into you. That obviously adds up. That can be pretty costly.
Absolutely.
Speaking of costly, how much does it cost to evict a tenant? So once again, this varies, but the process averages about $3,500 per TransUnion. And TransUnion is one of the 3 major credit bureaus. So we definitely trust them. They're also the ones that create our screening reports. So if you buy a screening report through TurboTenant, we use TransUnion. So it can average 3,500, but our first session of this webinar that we had last week, we had a landlord named GP who joined us. And do you remember how much did he say his cost him?
Yeah, like upwards of $15,000, between $12,000 and $15,000, which is horrifying.
Yeah, so it can get very costly. So landlords pay the court fees, legal fees, tenant turnover fees, and then of course those other costs like the time lost, the lost rent. Most of these costs are tax deductible, but still, it can definitely take up a lot of your time and make a dent in your bank account.
Absolutely. And before we move on, that $3,500 figure, that's just the costs, not counting any kind of lost rent. So bear in mind, it's going to stack up, unfortunately.
All right. And I see Yasmin just asked us any options to recoup unpaid rent. Well, look at that.
Great question.
So possibly, again, it depends. So depending on your state, you may or may not have received payment for past due rent by the time the tenant moves out. If that's not the case, you still have some other options, including deducting the missed rent from your taxes, depending on your accounting method. So if you use the cash accounting method, rent debt would be considered uncollected income. So it would not be recorded as income or be deducted as an expense. On the other hand, accrual accounting means that the landlord recognizes the rental income at the start of each month. So if accrued rent is included in income but not collected, then landlords are able to write it off as a bad debt. Sole proprietors, if that's how you set up your rental business, they can do this using a Schedule C form when they schedule or when you file your taxes. Just make sure to check with your accountant, as well as, once again, your local and state landlord laws, to know what you can and cannot deduct, because that changes depending on your location. And then your last option, you could also sue for payment, which would take you to small claims court. So some states allow you to sue for unpaid rent at the same time as the eviction hearing. Other states, you may be required to file another small claims lawsuit against the former tenant in order to receive back payments on the overdue rent. Just bear in mind that the tenant, if they were unable to pay rent, they're probably unable to pay you now. There's likely a reason that they were unable to pay rent, such as, they're unemployed or had some other kind of hardship. And thus it may not really be worth the time and effort to go after them in court. I know as landlords, that is not awesome to hear, because these people have already cost you money. You of course want to try and get that back, but in some cases, it's very difficult to do so. Okay, so then let's say that you successfully evicted somebody. If they left things behind, what do you do with the stuff? So trash can be removed, but abandoned belongings with value should be treated carefully. Again, we're going to quote NOLO. Look up your state's rules. So your state likely does have rules about notifying the former tenant about their abandoned property, or storing it, or disposing of it, or using funds from the sale of it. So you may be required to store valuable belongings and reach out to the tenant for a set amount of time before getting rid of anything. Okay, and then we've been saying this the whole time, but what about alternatives? Let's say you have a problem tenant and you really just don't want to go down the eviction route. I think we've painted an appropriately bleak picture of how evictions typically proceed. There are alternatives. So one of them is to convert to a month-to-month lease. If somebody was annual, you could convert that to a month-to-month, let them go one more month. If there are still issues at the end of that month, just don't renew. You could also provide your tenant with rent relief resources. So if the issue is that they're not able to pay the rent each month, there are rent relief resources, which again, dependent on wherever your locale is, but there are plenty of those that you could look into. And then our last one is cash for keys. So cash for keys, basically the way this works is if you're nearing the eviction, an eviction proceeding, then you would say, hey, how about instead, I give you blank amount of cash, you give me the keys to the rental unit and vacate the property by this date. It may sound counterintuitive to pay them to leave when they have not been paying you. But given everything else that we just discussed, this can sometimes be the fastest and cheapest way of moving on from a problem tenant.
That's true. So I'm going to drop a blog here in the chat. And also our guest landlord has definitely gone through a cash for keys situation or two in the past. So Brendan, if you're there, would you like to share your thoughts about cash for keys and why you might elect to choose that over an eviction?
Yeah, sure. Am I on? Can you hear me?
You're on. We can hear you.
Okay, yeah. So I'm from I'm representing I got the shirt on.
Nice shirt.
TurboTenant. Yeah. All right. So yeah, I'm from upstate New York, and I would say for us, we've only actually gone through the actual eviction process through the courts once, but we've encouraged many people to leave by being creative, and cash for keys is probably the best way to do that. You see how much money it costs you and all of the trauma and the consequences that it can cost the tenant. So usually if you do the math in your head, you say, if it's going to take 3 months, I'm going to lose $1,000 a month plus paying the attorney and everything. You can usually put a number together, say, listen, we're not going to pursue any of the debt, and we're willing to give you $1,500, or with some people we've done $500, but I'll bring a truck and I'll help you move. Like we've gotten creative with it to get to move on to the next tenant essentially. And that's usually responded to pretty well by the tenant. Usually you can show some empathy and say, hey, I understand your situation, and let me help with your security deposit and maybe your first month's rent for the next person, because it's clearly just not working out living with us. And just one thing I'll say about that is sometimes that's the biggest obstacle. They're like, okay, I know I need to move. It's not a good living environment anymore. The relationship has gone south, but I don't have enough for security, whatever, to move into that next spot. So you can cash for keys and help them. I would say in New York, at least, they need to return the keys and step off of the property. So you meet them at the curb, get all their personal belongings off the property, and then exchange the keys, and then you can give them a hug or whatever you want to do, but you move on.
Nice. Well said. We did have one person in the chat say that they read it wasn't legal to buy out the tenant, but it sounds like that's either different from your situation or otherwise maybe untrue, because I feel like it'd be pretty bold to come on here and tell us you were committing a crime. So is it on the up and up to do a cash for keys buyout in New York?
Yeah, you can. And I think it's pretty common, especially during the moratorium. I think that was a pretty common practice.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that.
Okay, we have one more slide and then Brendan will come back. Okay, so last but not least, how do you avoid an eviction? We've talked about how they're not awesome, and we've talked about the alternatives, which maybe you're thinking those also don't sound very awesome. So how do we avoid one altogether? The most effective way to do it is to make sure you are getting a great tenant and to make sure that you have a great lease agreement. And when I say great lease agreement, I really mean one that covers any situation that may arise. So we recommend reviewing your lease with a real estate attorney and prioritizing tenant screening by leveraging background, criminal history, and credit checks. And quick plug, yes, you can use TurboTenant for your screening reports. Ours are very comprehensive. If it's allowed in your area, then we include background, criminal history, credit check, eviction history. Huge red flag. Obviously, if somebody has been evicted before, then it may happen again. So that may not be your first choice of person to move in. Also, we recommend to gather landlord references, meaning if somebody is interested in moving in, ask to speak with their previous landlord. That can be very insightful. And then once again, to maintain good documentation of everything. So conversations, complaints, emails, texts, whatever it may be, it's a great idea to compile all of this stuff. If you do use the TurboTenant platform, you can actually upload documents right into your account. So you could take screenshots, take whatever you think is going to be pertinent and upload it right there. And I did see somebody in the chat ask if it is possible to use other tenants' complaints in an eviction proceeding. And yeah, absolutely. This kind of goes back to the URLTA, which Krista was talking about just a moment ago, that the tenant's rights, and this is pretty much true across the board, actually it is true across the board, that the tenant's rights, one of them is to live in a safe and peaceful manner, I think is how they word it.
Yeah, the quiet covenant.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. So if they are disrupting the neighbors, or especially if it's other tenants that are in the same rental unit, that is absolutely could be grounds for an eviction if it continues.
All righty. So now we are very, very lucky to have an expert landlord willing to share his experiences with an eviction. So Gurpeet, GP Singh, is on the line with us. He has 20 plus years of experience and he is a landlord in Maryland. GP, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course.
Wonderful. So I've outlined a little bit of context here, but could you tell us about your eviction story with your tenant of 15 to 18 months?
Yes. I will say that we've been doing this for a couple decades. We have a growing portfolio of residential real estate, and we've very, very rarely have to go through the eviction process all the way. It's probably only happened 2 or 3 times over the decades. And in this particular case, the tenant was there for between 15 and 18 months. The primary reason for non-payment of rent was a separation between the couple. Normally, when something like this happens, we try to work with the tenant and maybe work out a payment plan, maybe give them a little bit of time to catch up. We usually work through this process for 3 months, 3 to 4 months, maybe at most. If we're not making progress in that time in terms of catching up and maintaining the rent, that's when we consider the process of potentially going through an eviction, a formal eviction process. And normally for us, we have to get in Maryland between 2 and 3 money judgments from the court before we can continue down the process of an actual eviction or get a right to evict. After that, there's a process for scheduling with the sheriff, and each of these steps between getting a money judgment, getting the right to evict, getting the sheriff to come out is usually a few weeks, maybe up to a month or so for each step of that process.
Oof, yeah, that certainly is a long timeline. Okay, so with that in mind, I would love to ask the audience if whether you've been in this situation before with a non-payment of rent, or you're just thinking about it here with us. How long would you wait to formally begin the eviction process? So please feel free to answer here. Now, bear in mind, this is not going to have all of the legal nuance that your particular state or city might offer, for which I apologize. This is mostly just to get you thinking about the types of decisions you'll have to make if you do pursue an eviction. Okay, the answers are rolling in. GP, you mentioned, as we let the folks answer, you mentioned that this has only happened a couple times where you have to go all of the way through the eviction process. And I know that your business started with your grandfather. Have there ever been cases, either in your own firsthand experience or with him, where you started the eviction process, but either the tenant just abandoned ship completely and you had to figure out something else, or otherwise took a turn that you weren't expecting?
Absolutely, that happens all the time. So as I said, going through the entire process was 2 or 3 times, but we've probably gone through the process of having people started the process and people either having abandoned or paying partially or negotiating something in the middle, probably dozens of times. So that's much, much more frequent when somebody's not paying, where we work something out during that the first couple months of their delinquency and payment.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So here you can see the spread of how long folks would wait. It looks like the vast majority would wait 1 to 2 months after the first incident of missed rent. Some folks are waiting 3 days after the first incident of missed rent. Again, it's challenging when it's a business and you're expecting that money to go toward other expenses in your life. But GP, you mentioned that you waited 3 to 4 months after the first missed payment. Can you explain how you have that flexibility? Because I imagine there are landlords in the audience who are like, oh gosh, that's a long time to wait to start this kind of lengthy process.
Yeah, we've been doing this a very long time, and we kind of expect some level of vacancy, and we expect that there are going to be some issues along the way, and that we will have to work out some sort of payment plan. Also, it's really important to note that this is not a primary business for any of my family. Real estate is a growing part of our business, but it's not our primary source of income. So we don't rely on the real estate at all to make any payments for our personal lives. We do that from our own businesses. This is purely an investment portfolio that's growing over time. And so we can take a little bit more losses short term to ensure that we have a smooth process for us in terms of management.
Yeah. Thank you for being willing to share that, because I imagine some folks are not in that same position. And so they're going to want to adjust their approach and still check in, still give their tenant time to have that conversation, but maybe pursue things in a different cadence. Okay.
We have actually seriously thought about switching to a very strict process and essentially filing paperwork as soon as someone's late to use it as a forcing function. We haven't actually gone to the implementing it yet. It's just a lot more work, and we're not sure how much more effective it'll be at the end of the day, given all the extra effort required.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so taking us through the timeline here, you have the missed payment, and then 3 to 4 months go by. You start the eviction process, which you mentioned in Maryland requires a money judgment. At that point, after you've gotten that money judgment, let's see, landlords, if you are in GP shoes, what would your next step be? Oh, heck yeah. Okay, get some answers in here. Again, this is just to put you in the mindset of, thinking through these kinds of tricky decisions.
GP, I'm not sure if you were trying to turn your video on earlier. You should now be able to if you want to. Don't feel pressured.
Okay.
All right. We'll let this roll for a few more seconds here.
Perfect. Yeah, it's interesting to see the distribution. All right. Hello, GP.
Hey, GP.
Hello.
Okay,
Good
we
to
had a
see
question in the chat, which was, what is a money judgment?
Yeah.
So you have to establish the fact that they're actually behind on rent. And you do that by getting a money judgment. You provide documentation that they're this many payments behind, or they're this amount behind. This process takes place formally in court. You're supposed to be there as a landlord, and the tenant is supposed to be there as well. If either side doesn't show, the other party gets the judgment. And so you're just establishing how far behind they are in terms of dollars. It doesn't matter why.
Well said. Thank you. So here we have the results of the poll. A lot of you would be tempted to call the tenant as your next step, or otherwise, it isn't even split between pursue an additional money judgment or change the locks. I have the privilege of knowing the story. So GP, you did have to pursue an additional money judgment, right?
Yes, in Maryland, you're required at least 2, possibly 3. So those laws are changing here and there, but when I had to do it, it was 2. And so you have to have 2 consecutive money judgments before you can go after the right to evict.
Wow. Okay, and I want to be cognizant of time. So I should say with each of these steps, you might have mentioned it, it was at least a month, correct? Where you're like, okay, money judgment, that takes 1 month, second money judgment, another month, and then you move on to the scheduling of the eviction, correct?
Yes, so it's about a month for each one.
Wow.
Between each step.
Yeah. Wow, it is quite a process. And then at the end, I believe you had the sheriff come out to assist. Is that true?
Cool. Yeah, the final step is to actually call the sheriff and schedule an eviction, and they'll set the date. And at that point, they'll also, once you schedule, they'll begin posting notices on the door of the tenant so that they know this eviction is coming and when it is coming, so they can plan to either leave or be present. And the sheriff actually physically shows up there on the day of eviction, and they watch. They don't actually do anything other than to ensure orderly conduct. They just kind of watch the process. And so you also have to hire movers to go ahead and move all of the belongings outside of the house onto the lawn. And if the tenant's not present, then you'd have to store it. But if the tenant is present, then you can just kind of put it out on the lawn and then change the locks while the sheriff watches.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds like it could be a tense situation. So I'm glad that the sheriff is there to keep the peace, even if they're not helping to load out boxes.
Yeah.
All right. So I believe you said, could you share in total how much money was lost throughout this particular eviction process?
You could say 6 to 7 months of rent at $2,000 a month. So maybe $12,000 to $14,000 in lost rent. Maybe they made one payment, so maybe 10 to 12,000.
Wow.
You also have the turnover cost of the property could be between 4,000 and 6,000. Maybe new carpets and paints and different things we might do just to kind of fix up the property. And then of course, some of the court fees. We don't normally use an attorney. The court fees are maybe a few $100. It's not that bad. And then of course the movers, which might be another few $100 to $1,000, something like that. So it could be anywhere like 10 to 15 up to $20,000 situation, depending on
Wow.
how long you wait and how bad it gets.
Yeah. Yeah. Casey
And
said in the chat, I'd go broke.
Good news is it's really only been 2 or 3 times over decades. So it normally doesn't get all the way that far.
Yeah. Thank goodness, frankly. Okay, let me see if there are some questions we can fire off. Again, being cognizant of time here. GP is an important and busy man. Let's see. Collection of a money judgment. How do you approach that? Is that something where you go to the court and you ask them to grant a money judgment, or otherwise, how do you start that process?
You fill out a form. You go to your county office and you fill out a form and describe which months of rent they're behind, provide some details on the property, provide some details on the tenant, and formally disclose these months, this amount for each month, the late fee. And that way it's specific to that filing or that form. And so you have to, if they, for example, if the tenant catches up on those payments before that happens, before that judgment is issued, then you can't get a judgment on that anymore. So it's specific to the months of delinquent rent.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That makes sense. Okay, Kenneth said he has a similar situation with his DC property. Yeah. Let's see. Any other questions for GP or about the eviction process in general? I see you guys are answering each other's questions in the chat, which I love. Great to have some community in here.
Yeah, we had one person ask, how long do you leave their stuff on the lawn? We sort of talked about that it varies by location, but GP, I don't know if you want to talk about removal of tenants' property after an eviction.
In our situation, the tenants were present, so I believe that because they're present, it's on them to determine how long it stays on the lawn. If they just leave it after a few, maybe a week or two, a week, maybe we'll wait before we throw anything out. I don't know the actual rule for that in Maryland, but we waited about a week, and because the tenant was there, we assumed it was pretty much abandoned at that point. In terms of somebody here just asked also a question, which was the cost for eviction, if they're deductible. Yeah, they should be. Everything related to your business should be deductible. But again, like they said, for cash, in terms of rent, if you're in cash, you haven't actually accrued the rent, or you haven't actually earned the rent, so you can't write off something you haven't actually earned yet. So the lost rent is different. But aside from that, all the hard costs are deductible.
Yeah, good point.
Well said. Does the eviction application have to be in the name of the owner, or can it be in the name of the property?
I think it depends on the form, but I believe that you would write the name of the owner as a part of it, and then you could put a contact in there as well if it was different. Like if you had an LLC and if you had a different person as a contact, I think you can list both, and that's not a problem. The case would be between the LLC and the actual tenant, though.
That makes sense.
Okay, we do have one final poll question that I'm going to go ahead and fire off.
Yeah.
Okay, it should be showing up for everyone right now. Once the court has set an eviction date, what would be your next step?
Nice.
Oh, wow. This one's pretty decisive.
Yeah. Always love to see it. I'm gonna attribute that to GP's excellent storytelling.
Ooh, GP, where are you?
I am in the Bahamas, Nassau, Bahamas.
Wow.
And you took the time to be with us today, guys. Can we get some thank yous for GP in the chat? That's very nice.
My
He's got the
God.
whole ocean out there, and
I
he's
was
talking
gonna
about
say-
eviction.
It's
I was
my
gonna say
balcony.
Yeah, that's not what Maryland looks like. I got a lot of thoughts, like a lot of thanks coming in on the chat. That's awesome. Okay, we are going to end this poll, sharing the results. Okay, so 80% of you would call the local sheriff to schedule the eviction. 13% of you would do nothing. You would just wait for the court to do their thing. And 7% would post the listing online with a move-in date shortly after the eviction date. Yeah, got to get that rental income flowing again. I get it, 7%.
True, but 7%, do be careful, because let's say anything happens with the eviction date itself. Maybe there's a bunch of belongings left in there, or it's really messy. If the move-in date is too soon after that, you might be in a bit of a pinch. So do call your sheriff as needed, and then get everything out of the way, post it back up, find a great tenant, and you will start earning rental income again.
I will add that we've adopted an interesting strategy for our portfolio, since it's so closely located geographically, where a lot of times we're running postings all the time. We're
Nice.
collecting cell phone numbers, collecting contact information, and then we'll kind of, if they agree, we'll blast out, what's available in the neighborhood type of thing. And if there is an opening coming up like this, we will start promoting it even before the eviction is totally done. But we won't, of course, sign any leases until we get that officially wrapped up.
Yeah.
That is smart. All right. Well, everyone, it has been lovely chatting with you today. Before you sign off, as I mentioned, GP is a very talented, like a multi-talented individual. And I know you have a home inspection business. Do you want to plug it really fast and tell the folks about it?
Absolutely. So we have a nationwide home inspection business called US Inspect. You can check us out at usinspect.com. We do property management inspections as well. So we have some large clients where we do annual property inspections for them as landlords. And of course, we do the regular inspections as well when you're buying a new home or a new investment property or something like that. And the business has been doing this for more than 30 years. So we've been around a long time.
Nice.
Yeah. GP is a wealth of information in terms of the rental industry and house inspections. So if you need anything, please do reach out. I just dropped that link in the chat. It'll also be linked in the webinar page that we create for you. Otherwise, I hope you guys learned something today. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. We will be sending out this recording along with the deck by end of day tomorrow, I believe. Jonathan, any final thoughts? GP.
Nope. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Hopefully you enjoyed. When we end this in just a moment, you will get a survey. Please do fill that out. We really, really appreciate any thoughts you have on there. And you can also vote on what we should cover next month in our webinar. All right. Is she frozen for you, Brendan? She is.
Yes.
Okay.
She's frozen.
All right. She may be having some internet issues. Sorry about that. Okay, cool. So now here's Brendan again. So Brendan has been a landlord for over 5 years. And as he mentioned, he is in New York, in Schenectady, New York. And yeah, Brendan, do you want to tell us your eviction stories?
Okay, sure. Yeah, so the one that I went over with you guys to talk about, this was probably the biggest nightmare that we had of an eviction. We had a tenant that stopped making payments June of 2021. So June, there was no payment. There was a conversation. We had issues with this tenant in the past. So then I talked to him again at the end of June, hoping that July 1st would make a difference. And then July, there was no payment. So I decided, because of my own emotions, instead of pursuing the cash for keys, I said, you know what? I'm going to go through the eviction process. This gentleman has really pushed every button. So I went down, I got an eviction attorney that I knew of, and we gave a 14-day notice. That was in the very beginning of August. It finally was, the notice was sent out at the beginning of August. So that's 14 days essentially for them to make a payment or to leave the property. That's the first step in New York. So once I sent that out, he didn't make the payment and he didn't leave. So I requested a court date. That part cost about $350 to send that notice and then to get a court date in upstate New York. And the court date that they gave me was for March. So I was like, oh, wow, this is why you try as hard as you can to avoid the eviction process. And obviously, this is during, the tail end of COVID there, or the pandemic, I guess. And so not a normal circumstance in a state that was pretty, I would say during that time, every state was really trying to favor the tenants because of the chaos. So anyway, we were given a court date for March. And as March approached, the attorney called me and he said, because of the legislation in New York, if you follow through with the March court date, you can get him evicted, but you won't be able to have a cash judgment to try to recoup any of the lost money for that time that he hadn't made payments. They said, if you want, once January hits, you could submit it again and file a cash judgment, and then it would push your court date back a little, but then at least he would have to, you could recoup some of the money. So that was, March of the next year. So that was March 2022. And so I went down in January to submit that, to make the change there. So there'd be a cash judgment as well.
Wow. We have a question in the chat, which is, do you know if cash for keys expenses can be written off on taxes?
I don't know. I'd have to ask my bookkeeper how we handled that. Yeah, we've had times where, I think so.
Okay, I'm going to launch another one of our polls. So everybody should see this popping up right now. Okay, so this poll is purely hypothetical. Your tenant hasn't paid rent in a month. He's been late before. What do you do? See the answers flowing in. Okay, I'll let that run for a second. So Brendan, what happened with that tenant?
So essentially with him, once I went to the attorney's office and then filed a cash judgment, the judgment was for $6,500. And that was the back rent at that point. So then they submitted it to the courts and then they gave us a court date, but that next court date wasn't until June 1st. So it pushed me from, now I have no payment from June 1st through to June 1st. That's a full year. And luckily we own, we're managing right now 25 units, but you can imagine if you have a single family home and you're in that situation, that would be very difficult carrying a mortgage and everything. So yeah, that was kind of a shocker. And I said, wow, it's, this is not a fun process. So we went through until June 1st. I went to court. They did say, okay, you have 3 weeks to vacate the property or the sheriff will come and remove you and remove your belongings. And then I, counted the clock, counted the seconds until June 21st. And can I finish the story? I don't know if there's another.
Oh yeah, no, please.
So I got there on June 21st and he was actually on the back porch And I showed up and I said, I don't really know what to do, because I went through all the proper legal guidelines, and they gave the final day he has to be out, but he's still there, and didn't look like he was ready to go. So I said, I'm going to call the police. So I called the police. Once I called the police, he gave me the keys and he left. That's not a normal, I wouldn't say that that's a common situation. Most people, they don't want to go through the eviction. They don't want it on their record. They don't want that confrontation. But for this gentleman, every once in a while you find someone that is willing to push, to the breaking point. So he ended up leaving, and then thank God we were able to get another tenant in there shortly.
Jeez, that is crazy. A full year. All right, let me end that poll. I'm going to share this with everyone. Okay, so the question was, your tenant hasn't paid rent in a month. He's been late before. What do you do? Wow, neck and neck. In the lead, only by a little bit, is send a pay or quit notice. And then second place, talk to him informally. Very few of you said to wait 1 month and take action. And even less of you offered cash for keys.
Yeah, I would, just to chime in there, I would say don't immediately go to cash for keys. I think people see that. But once you get to the point where you're like, I'm about to start spending serious money, or maybe once you get to the point where you realize the relationship is broken there, then it's like, okay, we're going to have to do something. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I see a few people in the chat said, yes, any cash for keys expense is deductible. So thank you for that. Good to know the answer there. It looks like Carmina asked, what was your reasoning that you held up in court for the eviction?
Well, for him, it was not, for him was non-payment.
Yeah.
Yeah. For non-payment over that portion of time. And he didn't have good documented cause for hardship. There were people that were presenting hardship during that time because of COVID-19 specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It looks like Chris in the chat said, my tenant has already been evicted so much that she's been giving me the steps of how it will go.
Yeah.
That sounds like a red flag.
Yeah. I just want to say, we recently got a house that we rented out. We used TurboTenant all the way through, and man, it's been super helpful. And I would just say the best time to get rid of a bad tenant is before they ever move in. And it's better to spend 2 months worth of rent money with a vacancy before you rent it, finding that perfect candidate, as opposed to 3 or 4 or 5 months while they're living in it, potentially angry at you and maybe destroying property. So do it up front. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. It looks like John asked, what would Brendan do differently next time?
I would have had a more stringent screening process in the beginning. I'm a softie. So I met him, I heard his story, and I said, come on in, buddy. You know what I mean? Make yourself at home. So that was pre-TurboTenant days for me. And yeah, I think I would say you realize how naive you are when you first start doing this and trying to scale this. But yeah, I would have definitely screened better in the beginning.
Did you have a screening process back then?
No, when I first started, we were working with a couple of Section 8 coaches, basically case managers. We were working with a couple of local programs that would help people that were coming out of rehab, that did rent assistance and stuff like that. Yeah. So it was we were meant to be trying to house people that were having a hard time finding housing. Mm-hmm. But even in that environment, you can still take your time and find a good candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a question. It looks like a few people asked the same thing, which is about landlord references. Do you guys do landlord references?
Yeah, we do for the majority of our apartments. That's a great idea. One thing I would say also about that is, when the tenant comes, if the main character of their story is, if they're telling you their story of why they're moving, and the main point is how terrible their last landlord was, that's a red flag right there, because you're going to be the star of their next story. Don't, yep. if they're cursing out their last landlord, then say, oh wow, that's terrible, and don't jump in.
That's funny. That's something we always say with hiring too. If somebody is in the job interview talking about how horrible their last boss was. Maybe they were the horrible one.
Yeah, yes, so.
Is there any way that you can how do you verify those references when somebody gives you a landlord reference? How do you know it's
You can
legit?
call, you can request photos,
Mhm.
call the person. It is tricky though, and I'll say this from experience, if you're trying to get someone to move and they're finally gonna leave, and then you get a landlord reference call, you're probably gonna make that person sound good because you don't want them to stay. So I've had people that were cash for keys making leave, and then landlords are calling me, hey, are they a good candidate? And I'm like, yeah, no, they're really not. So you try to be realistic with them, but the references are not always great, because if they're trying to get rid of someone, then but that's why the screening report and the stuff you do is a little bit more concrete than just talking to their last landlord that could be their cousin or something.
Sure. Yep. Yeah, we saw something recently of somebody asking if, like, I can't find my tenant on any social media platforms. They don't want to come see the property. Didn't meet them face to face. Those are red flags. That's not somebody you should agree to rent to.
Right. And especially with the market right now, there's so many people looking for housing. I'm sure you guys are getting so many leads for every listing you put up. It's not worth rushing. Take your time and you'll find someone that appreciates it. You'll find someone that you can build a good relationship with.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Okay, so that was the one eviction that you've had to go through, and you mentioned the cash for keys. Are there any other, have you had any other cash for keys situations?
Yeah, we had a couple during COVID. I've helped a couple people with expenses to move. We did have some people that went through the New York State Rental Assistance grant program that came out during COVID too, which was pretty, it was helpful in some cases. We were able to recoup a lot of backed rent, but it's also a lot of workload for the landlord to apply for this grant and everything, and it's not what you signed up for in the beginning, but
Yeah.
you know, you got to do what you got to do. So, yeah.
And you mentioned that you have 25 properties?
We have 25 rentable units, and then some of them are broken up into private rooms. So, so those are a little unique because those are kind of transitional housing. You can't really do a screening report and stuff because you're trying to help people transition that you already know that they're coming out of a rough past. So,
Yeah. And in that time, with that many units, only one eviction has actually gone.
one that went all the way through the courts. Everything else I'll even go online and try to help people find a place to move. If there's issues, let's say they're having an issue with a neighbor, and that's like the crux of them saying, I'm so sick and tired of whatever. You know, you have to be a little bit of a therapist, a real estate agent, you're a handyman, you're a little bit of everything.
A
Yeah.
lot of hats to wear.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're nearing the hour here. Brendan, is there anything else you wanted to add about evictions? Our audience here, a lot of them have been landlords for a long time, but some of them are brand new. Are there any words of wisdom you'd like to impart?
I would just say the biggest thing is keeping a relationship with the tenant. If you don't like people and you don't have patience for people, then hire a property manager.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we've had tenants where, let's say, a spouse passes away or someone, and that's why they're late. And if you go and talk to them and say, listen, you're $300 behind, but I know you're going through funeral expenses, just never mind, we'll get you next month. If you're willing to do that, then people will feel convicted to take care of your property and to treat you with honesty and stuff. So I'd say you gotta keep care about the people involved, and you'll do good. And you'll stand out because there's not a lot of landlords that do. So you can shine you can shine pretty easily. And then the thing that you guys have where every month they can rate how they're feeling, if there's a maintenance issue, whatever, all that little stuff shows people you care. And at the end of the day, we have to look at being a landlord. The tenant is your customer.
Yep.
And like, if you look at Apple, for example, like they care about how their customer feels using the product, and they care about the feedback, and they try to wow them. So if you do that, if you have the same, perspective as a landlord, then you'll have happy tenants,
There you go. You just got to care about them. I love that. Treat them like they're your customer. I mean, they are. So
Absolutely. And if they don't, if they're not participating and making the payments, the whole financial structure of what you think you're going to do to set yourself up for retirement or whatever, it doesn't exist without them. So you got to love the tenant.
that's awesome. What a great way to end. Brendan, thank you so much for coming here and sharing your stories with us. It looks like Krista had a hard time reconnecting, but I'll fill her in on what she missed. And thank you everyone for joining us. Once I close this webinar, you'll all see a survey asking you what you thought about the webinar, and also giving you the option to vote on what we cover next month. We do this once a month. We have an educational webinar on a topic like this. So please do vote on what you'd like to see next time. And we'll follow up via email tomorrow with this recording and our slideshow. So thank you all, and have a great day.